Hello and welcome. I'm Linda McCray. This panel discussion is in conjunction with my exhibit at the Holter Museum of Art entitled The Spiritual in Abstract, Paintings by Linda McCray. This panel discussion will bring together art, history, and spirituality. And we will be talking about how art and spirituality connect, the history of abstract spiritual art, how to convey the spiritual in abstract visual language, and so much more. Our panelists include Hipólito Rafael Chacón, Ph.D. He is the Bruce and Suzanne Crocker Director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, and Professor of Art, History, and Criticism in the School of Art at the University of Montana, Missoula. He was one of my professors. In fact, he was on my MFA thesis committee. About halfway through my graduate studies, he asked if he could hang some of my paintings in his church. And when I saw him in a church, it was an aha moment. I hadn't thought of my art in a church before. Naturally, I was just going down the road that most artists do. Our next panelist is Reverend Edward Hislop, M.Div, M.A. in Liturgical Studies. Liturgy is a word used in some traditions that means the art of worship. Ed is the Director of Diocese of Helena, Office of Worship, Chair of the Diocese of Helena Liturgical Commission, and Chair of the National Federation of Diocesan Liturgical Commission. Rafael will be speaking from the art perspective, Ed from the spiritual angle, and I will be sharing from an artist's point of view. Our moderator is Cara Ewing, BFA. She has been special to me all of her life. She is one of my daughters. So now I'll hand this meeting over to Cara.
Our first question is for Ed. So Ed, how do art and spirituality connect?
Well, let me begin by saying that today is a wonderful day to have this gathering because it's a solemn feast in the Roman Catholic tradition, the feast of the dedication of the Lateran Basilica in Rome, which is the cathedral church for the Diocese of Rome. That is the place where the Bishop of Rome is bishop, and that, of course, is Pope Francis. So that's it's a very significant day because that, if you've ever been there, that in itself is a work of art and expresses the depth of the mystery of God. You could spend an entire week in that building and not absorb it all. You know, the high altar in that building is said to be built over a wooden table on which Peter himself is thought to have celebrated the Lord's Supper with the Christian community of Rome early on in the life of the church. And I think that the introit for that day, or for the feast today, reflects, I think, in a very real way what we're all about here today, or this evening. It begins with the quote from Scripture, Revelation, "Behold, God's dwelling is with the human race." And that means that we discover God not in some lofty kind of place, but in what is most deeply and nobly and truly human. And that means our artistic expressions, the way in which we are, in the words of Isaiah, like God, we are the potter. We've become potters and clay, and we're all working in the continuation of creation. One of the hymns that's often used on that day, I think I'd like to just not sing it, but one verse of it it's a beautiful hymn, and it's often used for dedication of the church, and it's often sung at the Basilica. All space is holy, for all space is filled by thee. But human thought burns clearer in some chosen place, where by thy own words of love we are taught. Powerful, powerful words, I think, in light of that. So how does art and worship or spirituality merge or connect? Well, sometimes it's very hard to distinguish the two because both express the other and the other expresses the other in that sense. We begin with imagination. Within our worship within the Catholic community and most of the major Christian liturgical traditions, imagination is at the very core of that. And our primary focus of imagination for worship, and therefore for art which reflects the spirituality of faith for us, is rooted in the mystery of the Paschal mystery of Christ. That is the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And that evocative and imaginative reflection is what shapes everything we do in our liturgical life and in the Christian community. So imagination and art, all of that expresses something that cannot be spoken of in words, but touches us in terms of puts us in touch with our creative nature and opens up a whole realm of spiritual experience that cannot be specifically defined, but that can be experienced. So I will leave it at that for this point, unless you want me to say more. And of course, I could say more.
Well, thanks, Ed. Oh, go ahead, Linda.
Oh, I just wanted to mention that years ago I was artist in residence with Ed at his church, and he taught me a great deal about liturgy. He's continually teaching me, as in tonight. But and we worked for a year on doing liturgical art and environment for his church that included my paintings. So nice to hear you talk about that, Ed. And I was just going to add that art and spirituality have gone together throughout time. They've been intertwined. Oldest theme in art. And every culture to humankind has made spiritual art.
Thanks. And Rafael, do you have anything to add?
I love the way Father Hislop opened this idea that these categories are not mutually exclusive. They are part and parcel of the same. And I think that sometimes artists may not know to what extent they are creating spiritual art. And it's often true that a lot of the art that people think is spiritual may not necessarily have great spiritual dimensions to it, but all of it is a sign of human, not just imagination, but human creativity and our divine spark. So I think that those two categories really need to be talked about in the same as the same. So yeah.
Well, thank you. And so, Rafael, the next question is for you. What is the history of abstract spiritual art?
Well, in some ways, we're asking. It's a tough question because it doesn't have an easy history. Let me put it that way. So we know, obviously, that in the Western European tradition, that religious art with the stories, the themes of spirituality, the Judeo-Christian traditions, has been intimately tied to what we consider art, great art. And but I think that there was a bit of a cleavage in the 19th century, which began to widen as we entered the modern age in the 20th century. And just as, in fact, the visual arts moved into the land of abstraction, that is, images that were non-objective, didn't have clear representation, were not really telling stories in the way we were used to seeing art tell stories, that and as art became more and more about itself, about its own properties, that degree of abstraction meant that there was, in fact, a cleavage, a separation from the tradition, the roots of visual art in the Western world, which was, in fact, to tell the stories, and often the great stories, the biblical narratives, the lives of the saints, the lives of the Virgin, the lives of our Savior. I mean, those stories which were so intimately tied to great art, all of a sudden were kind of shelved. And in fact, art began to tell a story about itself, its own properties, its own formal qualities. And so what we see increasingly in the 20th century is an art that is more and more abstract, less and less connected to that storytelling, less and less connected to representation. And so in some ways, spiritual abstract artists have had this daunting challenge of bringing those two traditions back. And in some ways, finding truth in both, truth in abstraction, truth in narrative, and re-merging those stories that in some ways were, I think, of artificially ripped apart early in the 20th century. That's my sort of summation of that story in a nutshell. But we can talk more about that if you want.
Thanks. So Linda and Ed, do you have anything to add?
Well,
You said it well, Rafael. Go ahead, Ed.
I would just add or say that I think that it's not an either or, but a both and in terms of the abstract and the what we might call realism or literal. And even in some of the abstract art, such as your art, Linda, one can gaze upon that and enter into it, and it is evocative of imagination. And depending on what you might identify it as, I can look at it and see that, but I can also move into that, deeper into that mystery. The same thing can be said, though, for example, the cathedral, the windows at the cathedral. Those are beautiful examples of very fine art glass. And they're very literal. And so you can look at them and you can just say, well, that's the Last Supper, for example. Or you can also go there and gaze into them. And even though it's the Last Supper, various experiences can come to a person by gazing into that. The light, depending on the time of the day. So even though they're one form of art, they also can they can flow into what we might define, or some might define, as more abstract, because it's literal, but then again, it's not, because you enter into it in a different way each time you see it, and they're living. So that's what I mean by saying it's really both and in terms of our worship and our spirituality, and in terms of church art or being part of a liturgical space.
Yeah, and I might add that it's actually a cliche, and it's false, that abstraction, that abstract art in the 20th century, in the modern age as it has come to us, that it was devoid of spirituality, that it was devoid of spiritual motivation, spiritual impetus, yearning, desire. In fact, in the early 70s, the Museum of Modern Art did a major exhibition that looked at the spiritual in abstract art. And what they told us was what we knew to be true, that many artists were not just spiritual individuals, practicing church members, that sort of thing, but that a lot of abstract art was motivated by a desire to come closer to God, a desire to be to come up with more accurate representations of that which can't be depicted, which is spiritual realities. And so and that show rightly pointed out that people like Vasily Kandinsky in Russia, coming from the Orthodox tradition, believed that abstraction was a way to approximate the Godhead, to come closer to the spiritual reality and to God. And so there are, of course, literal representations, and then there are abstract representations. And I think that they both can lead us to spiritual truth. And so I think that, that we have sort of misshapen our notions of modern art as somehow devoid of it. Abstraction in particular, devoid of any content, let alone spiritual content, is really not entirely true. I think they both have had a very strong sort of dose of that spiritual desire and that yearning, that seeking. And I think that if one allows oneself to enter the work, then one can find truth in it as well. So
I want to bounce back to Ed's comment about the stained glass windows. And I believe it was Vasily Kandinsky that talked about how he liked the feeling that he got when he walked into a church, not from the religious perspective at all, but that feeling. And that's what he wanted to convey in his abstract work.
Yeah. It's interesting that we're talking about a Russian artist, because another great Russian artist from a completely different religious tradition is Marc Chagall, who was Jewish. And I think his work, which is in that sort of land somewhere between representation and abstraction, it rests very happily in that land between, is in fact full of that vivacity, the liveliness of the spiritual imagination. And he was an artist who lived in Orthodox Russia, in a Jewish community, and yet was able to kind of universalize this love of God and this expression of the beauty of life and the spiritual content of life through his own imagery.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'm sure you know the work in the Art Institute of Chicago, because you studied there, Rafael, of Chagall's stained glass windows.
That's right.
And I'm not sure exactly how that went about, but I know that he worked on drawings and paintings as well as in glass, and it's a breathtaking piece.
And of course the power of the glass there is the light, and how how the light and color, the way those two elements come together to create this setting, this sense that we are in the presence of spirit. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great segue to our next question for Linda. How do you convey the spiritual and abstract?
Well, there are so many ways that we can convey the spiritual and abstract. And I'll use the painting behind me as an example of a few. This was, the name of it is Immersed in Water and Spirit. And I hope you can see it clear enough to see. But it's about baptism on the religious end. It's also about spiritual renewal on the universal spiritual end. So you have dying to old ways and rebirth. So in that black area is made of ash. I made the paint with a wooden charred stick, and went at it and chopped it up and then added the medium which glues it together to make the paint. It's a very rough texture, and so sometimes I use materials in an abstract way to express the spiritual. And I always use light. I always use the abstract element of light and dark, and there's I think which abounds in symbolism. And for me, I have light in all of my paintings, because that is how I image my creator. So in this painting here, you've got those two elements. And then you also have, you may not be able to see, I can't see it real well on my screen, but there's some white paint kind of in the background that I put on, and then I just smeared down. And that is just subtly water, earthly water. And then there are drops of gold paint everywhere, and I let some of them drip to express that spiritual renewal. And so that is a few examples on there. I wish I could show you a few more paintings, but there's all sorts of different ways. I also use sand from the River Jordan and Montana, mix it in as a symbol for that we are on holy ground everywhere. So there are just a lot of ways to express spirituality with abstract elements.
If I could just jump in here and characterize your art a little bit, I think that for me the most powerful element in your work is the idea of transformation. And if I just look at your work sort of formally, to me it's work about process. I can see your process. I can see your moves, your gestures. I can see the way you work with materials, and to me they're always in some form of transformation. And I think there's really no better metaphor, in my opinion, for the spiritual life, because it is about transformation. There wouldn't be a spiritual life without the sense of the human being encountering the divine, being changed by the world around us, by the Spirit. And so I appreciate the level at which your work is about that concept, that idea of transformation from one element to another, from one state to another, from one, just in the work, just in the painting that I'm seeing there. I see this gradation between light and dark, between what seems solid and what seems fluid. And those dualities and all the in-between, to me, is transformative. So I feel in some ways that's I don't know if that's an intentional strategy, but I see it there.
Well, thank you. I like that insight.
Can I just add something to that, or make a comment? I think that whole reflection also can be stated as a principle of liturgical celebration and an understanding of the liturgy of the church. Because everything that we use in the liturgy, water, oil, touch, bread, wine, movement, song, all of that evokes an ability to see ordinary things in a whole new way. And taking what's commonplace, like what you did in that painting, commonplace and ordinary, and transforming it into an idea of something else. That demands imagination, as does genuine worship. We cannot truly worship if there's no sense of imagination, taking the ordinary and seeing something beyond what is visible there, entering into the mystery of what is ordinary. So so all of the symbols and postures and gestures and used in the liturgy, like I said, bread, wine, touch, oil, water, bath, whatever, all of the things we can come up with, it's all about what is ordinary, and in that ordinary, seeing the extraordinary, which tells us that it's in the ordinary where God is ultimately found, not in some extraordinary out-of-this-world experience, but the ordinary takes us into that extraordinary imaginative.
I would like to jump in of abstraction being a way to flee the mundane and the humane, and to actually try to find some other plane that we might exist on, and how that has continued to be a really compelling resource for painters for over 100 years.
Let me respond to that. I think that there are many traditions, both Western and non-Western, that see the artist as almost a shaman, as being able to transform elements, and in that process of transformation, revealing spiritual truth. And I think both in the East and Western churches of Christianity, we have a concept of art as a ministry, right? We don't have a notion of art, of the artist as a priest necessarily, as some global traditions do.
Well,
artists have, in some ways, play a special role. That's my point. My point is that whether they are in the secular world of the art world, or whether they are in spiritual traditions and creating their art out of those spiritual traditions, that at some level they could be understood as in fact revealing spiritual truths. And so to me, it doesn't matter. I mean, there are artists who were very much a part of the religious tradition, their particular religious traditions, and were able to articulate their particular notions of faith well. And then there are plenty of artists who reveal spiritual truth without having that tie or that anchor in a spiritual tradition. I mean, actually, in the West, there's a cliche about Georges Rouault, the French artist, as being the last great Catholic artist of the 20th century, early 20th century. And then there's also an equally powerful cliche about Henri Matisse as being the greatest atheist to make the best Catholic art of all, because here he was this man who was a skeptic and called himself an atheist, and yet made some of the most beautiful, transcendent spiritual places in Roman Catholicism. So, but my point there is that whether an individual identifies themselves necessarily as they're seeking spirituality as their overt agenda as an artist, that they may or may not, they may in fact be indulging themselves in spiritual pursuits, and they may in fact be revealing things or even offering opportunities for us to find spiritual reality and spiritual grounding.
So Ed, does abstract art have a place in today's religion? And is it better for worship than other styles, such as realism?
Well, immediately I would say absolutely. It does have a place in religion. It certainly would have a place in worship, as to all styles of art. There needs to be a room in our faith and in our church traditions for every style of art, both the traditional realism and abstract, and whatever combination of those things can be characterized. So, for us, we might say that, to quote one of the doctrines of the church, God does not need our worship. We need to worship God, and we only have our own arts and our own styles of expression in which to celebrate. So every form of art can have a powerful spiritual dimension to it. It can have a deepening effect on our own spiritual life, and it can certainly help reveal the presence, the abiding presence of God in what is both ordinary and extraordinary. So yes, any kind of art really does have a place in church, as long as it leads us to a deeper reflection of who we are and how we connect with God's mystery. So I would say yes. And the addition to that would be our goal within the normative Christian tradition is all of that leads us in some fashion into the primary mystery, which is the Paschal mystery of Christ, life, death, and resurrection, then and now, in the world in which we live, and how that's articulated, how that's lived out, how that's acted in the world in which we live and in the experience that we have. Beyond that, I would also say that there's no real word, a human word or art, that contains or exhausts God's mystery. But all words and all art forms can be used to praise God in a liturgical assembly. That's part of the teaching of our church, that everything has a place or can be brought in to reflect and evoke the abiding presence and the mystery of God in the midst of it.
I like that idea because it's there are plenty of religious traditions that have restricted or narrowed the parameters, drawn very tight guardrails around artistic expression and how, in fact, spiritual truth can be conveyed. And but I like this idea that in fact faith can't be contained in narrow parameters, and that if indeed human imagination, human creativity are God's gifts, then the full exercise of those things is a marvelous experience.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Yes.
Linda,
That
would you
does
like to
mean also
add?
that within our worship experience, we should never trivialize it. On the other hand, that everything should have a sense of being beyond itself or special. Everything that is seen and heard. The very liturgy itself in our tradition is itself a work of art. From the beginning, every element of it, from the gathering, from the environment, from the building, the light, the darkness, the water, the song, the proclamation, the vesture, everything has to do with the work of human hands. And so the whole worship experience itself is a work of art. And to some extent, that is in some circles, that's seen as a problem, that we need to get in there, do it, and get it done with, and the simpler the better, rather than letting the actual human experience open up and be uncontrolled. We like to control things in the church and elsewhere. In that same light, one of my favorite teachers, which is about 100 years ago at Notre Dame, always ended her class, and she was teaching art and liturgy. She always ended the class by saying, remember, we become what we perceive. If we see what is cheap and shoddy and uncaring, then we tend to become cheap and shoddy and uncaring. And she writes in one of her many books, our spirits cry out to be lifted up, consoled, joyously encountered by the divine, by the holy, and art helps that happen. As a matter of fact, it's only through art, in whatever form it is, that can happen.
Thanks. All right. So our next question is for Rafael. What is spiritual art and what is religious art?
Yeah, that's an important distinction. And I think maybe I kind of answered it not knowing the question was coming up, but this idea that there's art that is that meets the needs of a religious tradition, that I think is religious art. It's art that's specifically made within the boundaries of a religious tradition. Spiritual art is much bigger than that, and to me, spiritual art, it's a little like what we were saying earlier, that in some ways all art has a spiritual dimension because it's created by humans who are created in God's image. And so I think spiritual art is in some ways the bigger umbrella. It's the larger umbrella. Whereas I think that religious traditions, and not to be disrespectful, some of them are exquisite. They're beautiful. They have their own rules and standards and guidelines and histories, long histories. Those tend to be narrower in some ways. And I think that there's, some of those, a lot of those what I think of as religious art in some ways, to me, falls flat. It doesn't contain in some ways what spiritual art can contain, which is in fact much bigger and more moving in some ways. So I think of spiritual art as found in many religious traditions and many artistic traditions. And what the thread that runs through it is the open heart of the artist, and the way that the elements can in fact move us beyond our narrow confines, our narrow boundaries. So I think of spiritual art in some ways more dynamic to me, although within religious traditions, following the thread of the religious arts is quite lovely and wonderful. I think, for example, like Islamic art, it has clear parameters depending on what country you're in or what region, but it has a long history. It has a certain loyalty to the faith and to the ideas of the faith, and it's coherent and it's beautiful and it's marvelous. But I think of that as one spiritual or one religious tradition within the whole idea of spiritual art. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thanks, Linda and Ed. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I would, and this is probably a bit out of context, but sometimes you speak about religious art, many people within the church setting often define that in varying ways. For some people, religious art is going to a catalog and picking something out to hang in the church, rather than engaging an artist, rather than doing something that reflects the work of human hands. It's something that's made from a mold and run off on a machine or whatever. And that's a challenge that we have, from my point of view, in the church today. The call to the church is that we are supposed to be engaging real artists for even what we would describe as religious art. For example, an image of Mary. Well, you can go to any religious goods catalog and you can get somewhat decent ones. Most of them are pretty terrible, but lots of churches just go and buy them rather than engaging an artist. And they think that it's a lot less expensive to do that, which sadly for some people, that's the attitude. But that's a real challenge in the church today. So when we begin to speak of art in the liturgy or art in church, whether it be spiritual, and I think it always has to be spiritual in the church. It can't just be so-called religious art. Although some so-called religious art can end up being quite spiritual and draw people into the mystery. But the tendency to go out and buy it from the catalog is pretty pervasive, at least in the Catholic Church these days, which is totally contrary to our tradition. But and if we have time, I'll describe an experience with that on another level, but later. But so I think that religious art in the church always has to be spiritual, from my point of view. So,
Father, I want to hear the story now. Don't tease us. Tell us the story.
It's just a story of the work that we did in Helena at St. Mary's, which is Linda's parish there now. I'll just do with the image of Mary that we had there. That's the patroness of the parish, and so we did some researching trying to find a artist that would do it, but we had some specific demands of that artist. Once we selected the artist, and it was Jerzy Konar. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Jerzy. He's a sculptor out of, I think he's in Chicago. I think he's still working. He's done some marvelous work. So we commissioned him, but our requirement was that he would come to the parish. First of all, what we did in the parish is we had a whole series of gatherings about Mary. Who is Mary to us? What are the various traditional ways Mary has been expressed within the tradition? Both Roman Catholic and Orthodox and other religions, iconography, all of that. And then we set up a series of questions for people to dialogue with the artist, for people to end up say, who is this image of Mary going to be for us, who's the patron of our church? Well, there were 3 or 4 gatherings, and the artist came to each one and listened. And then he would take those ideas and he would craft some image and bring it back, and people would say, yay, nay, that's not what we're trying to do. Also, what's important to remember, that was just on the beginning or the cusp of the millennium, the change. It was in the late 90s, so we're moving towards the millennium. And basically what people came up with in their discussions with the artist was that we do not want an image of Mary that is so-called traditional. We want an image of Mary that is a woman of the new millennium, that she is a new woman. She's ascended to heaven, but she is with us now, and she's on the move, and she's pointing to the mystery of Christ. So if you've ever seen that image of Mary, she's a beautiful carved woman. Her hair is blowing in the wind. She's moving toward the altar, but she's planted on Montana rock. We went out and found this big boulder to put her on, and we wanted her to be accessible. So that image of Mary is, in one sense, a reflection of something that might say is real. I mean, it looks like a woman, but when it's Mary, it takes on a whole different dimension. So there's a spirituality that comes out of the people of that parish, but also out of the work and hands of the artist who was able to fashion that and shape that to reflect that experience. So it was, of course, and I always say this, if it's good art, it's going to be controversial. And so it was controversial among some people. Well, it doesn't look like any Mary we've ever seen. And then what happened, interestingly enough, in that parish is after I left and new staff people came, the old image of Mary that used to be sticking way up on the wall that we removed and sadly did not take away, ended up being brought in and put in the main gathering space in a place that was designed for Mary on the Journey, a work of art by John and Gus Swanson. That was moved and the old image was put there. But so, I mean, that's a combination of realism, if you want to call it that, and that becoming something deeply spiritual. And now even whenever I go in that church and even though I sit there and just gaze upon that, I mean, there's all kinds of other reflections that come in about who Mary is. The woman of today, she's on the move. She's not humble and simple and taking it from anybody. She is going someplace. And that was what people in that parish in those days, in late 90s, wanted that to reflect, because they were very into the whole issue of the role of women and who Mary represented in light of that. So it's a very powerful reflection. So that's one. All the other art in that church was done similarly. The windows, the font, the altar, everything was done with that ongoing reflection with the people in the church, in the parish, about what these things mean to you. But it was not just, this is what I like. They had to be willing to participate in learning and in education and studying, and that they did. I mean, it was pretty amazing experience. So,
that's a beautiful example of how religious art can, in fact, be very much alive and connected to living communities. And I think, religious art gets a bad rap because it's conventional, because it's traditional, because it's the same imagery over and over and over and over again. And while that may be comforting, it's not an exercise in our imagination, our creativity, and our the ongoing gift of artistry among us. And so I think that that's a beautiful example of how you could have religious art that is full of spiritual life, because it serves and meets the needs of a community, that contributes to it, that embraces it, that creates it, that helps put it together, that makes all these decisions. That, to me, is a great example of how religious art can be the fulfillment of spiritual art. It's not simply, something that comes by rote or by repetition or convention or tradition. And, and in the industrial age, I mean, I'm glad you talked about how we think that it's cheaper to get an image because we can actually buy it, something that's been mass produced or whatever. but think about how disconnected that is from the life of the people, right? From the life of their spirituality. And so the model that you've given is a beautiful counter to that. So thank you.
On the other hand, in that same church, if you walk in there in Pentecost, and behind the cross is this beautiful work of Linda's that hangs from floor to ceiling behind the cross there, reflecting Pentecost. I mean, I've been there and just sat there and looked at that and just gazed in it. And it's Pentecost. I know that's what it's supposed to be, but all kinds of other images come out, all kinds of reflections. That's much more abstract in one sense, but also very powerful and very welcome in that community, I might add.
Well, thank you, Ed. And I want to add just one comment on Mary, that with the controversial Mary. At first, when I saw it, looking at from an artist's perspective, you have her standing steady on that rock and her hair is blowing. And if you look at that from compositional or the artistic point of view, you might say, well, she should be moving. Her foot should be forward. There should be something going on for her hair to be like that. But it speaks so strong of spirituality when she is strong and sturdy and there, and then the hair is just blowing. I just love that piece. I'm glad you brought that up, Ed.
And you notice that piece, the hair is blowing in the same direction that the wind in that part of Helena blows.
Oh, that's new insight for me.
And the same movement is seen in the hair of Jesus on the cross. If you look at that.
You know, it's
very deliberate on the part of the artist.
It's interesting that this idea of wind as a sort of a symbol of God's presence. I wrote my dissertation, back in the Jurassic Age. But even then, when I wrote about Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, and there are figures that are animated by wind. And, scholars have been trying to explain that wind. And to me, it's so simple. It's the presence of God.
Right.
And it's just simply symbolized by this moving force, this energy that sweeps us all, that it animates. And it also sort of moves us. It's really quite a simple metaphor, but an effective one.
Well, great. I feel like that discussion broadly covered our next question, which was directed at Linda. Can art be both spiritual and religious? Do you have anything you'd like to add?
I will. Of course, I believe they can be both spiritual and religious. And in fact, my artist in residency here, that was the focus of what I was working on. I was working on a series of painting that I've entitled The Gospel Truths. And I entitled that for its duality meaning of both the literal word, the religious end, and also the absolute truth. So that would be the spiritual truth side. And I have a painting behind me now that is one in that series. As an example, it was inspired by the genealogy of Jesus. And I started thinking of his family tree, my family tree, and then the whole world family tree. The title of this painting is Family Tree of Oneness. And there's symbolism in here. There's light in the middle that is I believe the inner light at our core, that spiritual inner light. And it is also in the form of a cross. There's you see at the top going across. And often the cross is referred to as the tree of life. I have green in there to symbolize life. And then I have gold lines, drip lines, just going all over the place and overlapping and intertwining to speak of all of the whole world, the whole interconnected of all of us. And also that there is divinity in all of us. So I'm using gold. Through the years, gold has been used to symbolize the divine by many, many artists. So absolutely, I believe that spiritual and religious can come together in one painting.
Linda, can I ask you a question? This is a question really about your spiritual discipline. So do you see these paintings, your process of creating them as a discipline, as a form of prayer, for example, as a form of meditation, for example, what happens to you when you create a work? Is it all created up here in your head? I mean, I have just a kind of, I want to hear more about your process.
Well, thanks for asking that. My spirituality and art process are truly one. I like to sit with or meditate on the word or a spiritual truth until I feel it in my heart. And then I bring it out through my heart and hand with pastels in my sketchbook or directly to paint. But it definitely is a spiritual art process.
So it starts with the truth and it ends with the art, with the materials, the colors, the textures, is that the way am I seeing that correctly?
Yeah, yes you are. And and I start, of course, I'm thinking of something specific. And then I want to take that to the universal level. So, and that comes through meditating with it for a while, to take it from the very literal into more of a universal spiritual, and really take it to heart, and then to bring it out.
Does that ever happen in the reverse, where you just are sketching and drawing and making things, and then all of a sudden the realities come through?
Yes, it's a continual process, because I like to give up control and then respond to the paint. So I do a lot more being with my paintings than painting. If I had an idea and I just painted it, it would be illustrated. And for me, that process is very stale. So the whole creation process is a learning process, a deepening of spirituality on my part, and yes, I am very much letting the paint speak and responding to that, and I very much learn along the way. So it's not everything decided at the beginning thing. In fact, I often have an initial sketch in my sketchbook. Sometimes I will go to a painted study, and then to these larger paintings, and those are just departure points, and yes, and that's why the process is so captivating to me, is that whole learning spiritual process. Thanks.
Is there tension in it? Do you ever find yourself at this isn't really conveying what I want it to? Is there?
It's not always. It's not always super pleasing. Yeah, sometimes I get to where, I don't know about this part, and then I leave it around in the studio for a little bit and see how it speaks to me or whatever. Sometimes I'll turn it over. But yes, it's a struggle. It can be a struggle. Sometimes it isn't, and sometimes it is. And that's really what keeps me going. It's like a puzzle. It's not just like you've just got a set way to go and that's it. It's a process.
All right, we'll move on to our next question for Ed. How does one characterize the relationship between religion and art today? Does the church welcome contemporary art?
Well, to respond to the last part of that question, yes, the church does welcome contemporary art. And the environment for art is, of course, a worshiping community, the place we gather, the assembly itself. And art demands that we open up all the symbols of our liturgy. And one of the basic fundamental principles of certainly Roman Catholic liturgy and the liturgy of the Orthodox Eastern Church would be a primary principle, and that is, in our liturgical assemblies, there's no such thing as a symbol being a sign of something. The symbol is the reality. So the gathering of the assembly is not just a bunch of people gathering together. It is the church gathering. The bread and wine is not just a sign of the presence of Christ. It becomes the presence of Christ. The proclamation of the word is not just somebody reading a story. It is God speaking. And the response of the assembly is a conversation back and forth. So that in itself, the art of the celebration is itself contemporary as well as traditional. So you really can't enter into the worship experience without both. You can't just live in what once was, and we can't just live in what now is. There has to be that the fullness of the human experience, which means the fullness of then and now. So contemporary art is integral to the liturgy, as is so-called traditional art. But the primary art in the liturgy is the assembly, the gathering of the assembly, and the power and the simplicity and the beauty of the symbols that we use, which we believe become the reality. They're not just a sign of something, but they are the reality. But does that answer the question? I think I got off track. I think that answered the question.
I think so. So Rafael and Linda, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I can't add more to that.
You know, the other thing I would say is that if we wanted to kind of define it a little bit, any kind of art that's brought into the liturgy or the liturgy itself, whether it be song or graphic art or symbol or anything, everything it must be of the highest possible quality, the best that we can bring. Otherwise, it's not really appropriate. Quality can be grasped only when we're able to contemplate because of what's there. We can contemplate it. It speaks to the beholder, whether it's the bread and wine or whether it's a beautiful image of Mary or whether it's a beautiful weaving done by a weaver or the texture of it, or whether it's something similar to what Linda brings us and the work that Linda does. You enter into it because it has a quality, it's honest, it has love and care in it, and that it's appropriate. I mean, there are some things that aren't appropriate in our gathering, perhaps. I could tell a story about that years ago, but I won't get into that. But it basically can't be anything trivial, cheap, shoddy, pretentious, pretending to be something that it is, or superficial. And those are sometimes difficult to discern, but that's the goal of trying to determine that. The art always serves the liturgy, and that in the sense of opens up the fullness of the mystery of God and is able to express the abiding presence of God in the life and in the spirit, in the hope and in the longing and in the struggle and difficulty of the assembly of the church. Basically, what the church teaches is that art is integral to the liturgy in its varying forms, depending on the circumstance, the time, the season, the year. But it's always got to be appropriate. I remember one time years ago, speaking of what's appropriate and not appropriate, this was in Butte at St. Anne's, and I don't know if you've ever been at St. Anne's Church, but it's huge, and it was built in the late '60s, I believe, and we had a fellow there who was he was from New York, and I don't know what he had a connection with Butte, but he was coming to Mass, and we had a Vesper service evening prayer during Advent. And he was a dancer, and he was a very good dancer. I mean, he danced on Broadway or something, and he offered to do a dance reflection of one of the scripture readings we were using. And I thought it was a great idea, and that it would be appropriate. Well, the church was relatively full, and I didn't see him beforehand. Well, he came out dressed in his white tights, and everybody in the community kind of did and I did too. And I thought, oh God, I should have told him not to wear tights. That's all people saw. They didn't see the dance. They didn't see the movement. They didn't see anything but his tights. And so it wasn't appropriate. The art form, the dance was, but the tights were not in that environment. So appropriateness is always something that you have to be careful of.
Well, I see that we're right about at an hour, and I have one question there, so I'll address that. The question asks is, do you see the path of your work, or do you see the path your work has taken? And if so, where is it leading you? And that is a very tough question. I appreciate the question. I am led by my heart, and after I was doing abstract spiritual art for a while, I showed it to Sister Rita McGinnis, and she said, there may not be a niche for you, but you'll have to create one. So I am just working at that and just following along with wherever my heart leads. So that's That's a very vague answer to your question, Thomas, but thank you for that question. And I suppose we should lead into our closing. Rafael, do you have some closing remarks?
Well, I just want to add to that, and not that I'm in any shape to do that, but I think that given what you taught us about your process, the way you work, that the Spirit will lead you. So the next step, the next phase, the next set of works will, in fact, because you're open and because your heart is desiring, you will be guided by the Spirit. And I'm fully convinced of that. So I have a lot of confidence that the next phase will be better than the last. So, yeah.
Thanks, Rafael. Yeah, and Ed, do you have any closing remarks?
Well, I'll just close with a little story that kind of reminds us to keep our eyes open for what is most basic, simple. There's an old story told about a mother who was very anxious. She went to see an old and holy priest. I don't know if there are any of those left, but anyway, she went to see a whole old and holy priest, and she had a problem. And her problem was that her small son, after he made his first Holy Communion, complained to her. He said, "Mom, God tasted just like bread." And she was very concerned about that. So she went to the priest and asked him what she should tell her son about that. And he asked her, "Is the problem that God tastes like bread? Or is it that bread tastes like God?" The true expression of art, the beauty of art, tastes like God. That's how we discover God, in what is very ordinary, but what is also sometimes very extraordinary. In our song, in our art, in what we do, what we offer, what we bring. That's where God is found. And God tastes like art.
Well, thank you, Rafael and Ed and Cara. Special thanks to the Holter Museum of Art and to Rosemary Howell. And it was her idea to do this panel discussion. And a very special thank you to all of you that have been joining us here. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks to all of you. Thank you, Rafael and Cara, and all of you who participated. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you and good night.
Good night.
Good night.